Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope all of you are doing well. In this video, I want to give my critique of the debate that took place back on February 1st, 2021, and this was the conversation between Darth Dawkins, also known as Gary F. Milne, and Dr. Lawrence Krauss. The following critique is not intended to be an exhaustive critique, nor is it intended to be what one may refer to as a defeater video. Instead, what I have did is give a few of what I consider to be Gary's most self-defeating statements. Statements that are, on Gary's own terms, unintelligible and incoherent. And how Gary's own claims about God's necessary attributes collapse under the weight of his shifting, contradictory, and incomplete definitions. By comparing Van Til's 7 core attributes with Darth's ever-expanding and inconsistent list, we show how his concept of God fails his own standard of ultimacy and perfection, rendering his transcendental argument unintelligible from the start. We then expose how his admission that he doesn't know what his God was doing sans creation, because it wasn't revealed, fatally undermines his insistence that only his worldview provides the preconditions of intelligibility. The result is a system that is internally unstable, epistemically blind at its foundation, and incapable, by Darth's own criteria, of grounding possibility, necessity, or rationality. Let's start by going through some of the statements Gary made during the discussion.
Yeah, Dr. Krauss, earlier you stated that God is not necessary. You can only make such a statement if and only if you first determine that God does not exist and that he's not ultimate and fundamental, instituting what's possible and impossible on a metaphysical level.
1. Gary said, "You stated that God is not necessary. You can only make such a statement if and only if you first determined that God does not exist, and that he's not ultimate and fundamental, instituting what's possible and impossible on a metaphysical level. Why this destroys Darth's worldview on its own terms. Darth asserts a complete attribute, that God institutes all possibility and impossibility, but elsewhere he admits he cannot answer what God was doing before creation because it hasn't been revealed."
Next up, M15TTRR3CT4NGL, thanks for your super chat. They said, "Duncan, what did your God do during the infinity before it created everything?"
What did my God do sans creation? I couldn't answer that question. It hasn't been revealed.
This contradicts his own rule. You cannot assert something about God unless God has revealed it. Thus, Darth is asserting unrevealed metaphysical content about God, violating his own epistemic rule. Also, there exists an attribute set contradiction. Neither P-Mars nor Van Til includes institutor of all possibility, impossibility as an attribute. Thus, in the context of this discussion, Darth's definition is idiosyncratic, non-shared, and therefore cannot serve as a universal precondition for intelligibility.
Dr. Krauss, I don't believe that you really addressed my question. You talked around it. You stated there's no evidence for God, which is the equivalent of saying that all the facts that you're acquainted with do not stand in causal relations to God.
2. The "all facts necessitate God" blunder. Gary said, "You stated there's no evidence for God, which is the equivalent of saying that all the facts that you're acquainted with do not stand in causal relations to God." Why this is self-defeating on Darth's own terms. He claims Krauss is asserting something impossible to assert, but his own worldview requires the very thing he says can't be known. Darth argues that Krauss cannot possibly know whether all facts stand in causal relation to God. But Darth himself claims to know exactly that all facts necessarily relate to God. Nothing can be a fact unless grounded in God. God is the causal source of all possibility. This means Darth claims exhaustive, absolute knowledge of the relations between all facts and God. Also, this violates Van Til's own attributes. To say you can know that every fact in existence necessitates God, you would need omniscience, to know every fact. Aseity, to not depend on any created fact for your knowledge. Sovereignty, to know God's causal activity exhaustively. Necessity, to know what is metaphysically impossible in all cases. Darth denies that humans have these attributes, yet he assigns them to himself every time he claims to know that all facts necessitate God. This is a performative contradiction. He demands omniscience while denying humans can have omniscience. Worse, Darth contradicts Van Til's doctrine of creator-creature distinction. According to Van Til, only God can know the totality of facts exhaustively. Humans know interpretatively, analogically, and always finitely. Humans can never survey all facts, all possibilities, or all metaphysical necessities. But Darth repeatedly asserts he knows what is metaphysically necessary. He knows what all facts ultimately depend on. He knows there cannot be any fact outside of God's causal structure. This collapses the creator-creature distinction and turns Darth into a mini-God epistemically. This also destroys his transcendental argument. His argument claims, only God can provide the preconditions of intelligibility. Humans are limited. Therefore, atheists cannot know. Yet Darth simultaneously claims to know the ultimate metaphysical structure of the universe, that all facts must relate to God, that no fact could ever exist independent of God. This level of metaphysical certainty requires divine attributes and therefore violates his own system.
I don't know.
Okay, so then if nothing is fundamental or ultimate, you are in a chance world. And if you're in a chance world, anything can happen. And if anything can happen, that destroys intelligibility.
3. Gary said, so then, if nothing is fundamental or ultimate, you are in a chance world. And if you're in a chance world, anything can happen. And if anything can happen, that destroys intelligibility. Why this is self-defeating, on Darth's own Van Tillian terms. Darth makes one of his most catastrophic blunders here. This single sentence collapses his entire system, because he accidentally affirms a condition that his own theology cannot escape. Darth claims, if you lack a known ultimate, you are in a chance world. According to Darth, if you cannot identify what is ultimate, then reality becomes chance, and intelligibility becomes impossible. But this is fatal to his worldview because he openly admits elsewhere that he does not know God's eternal activity, saying, I couldn't answer that question. It hasn't been revealed. If Darth cannot identify what God did sans creation, then he is admitting ignorance about God's eternal relations, God's eternal actions, God's internal necessity, God's aseity in eternity past, the eternal grounding of possibility itself. By Darth's own definition, if you don't know the ultimate, you are in a chance world, which means Darth's own system collapses by his own standard. Also, this contradicts Van Til's definition of intelligibility. Van Til teaches that creaturely knowledge is always partial. Humans cannot know God's eternal activity, yet intelligibility remains possible because God knows all things. Darth reverses Van Til. He says humans must know the ultimate, or else intelligibility is impossible. Thus, he is not defending Van Tillian presuppositionalism. He is defending Darthian hyper-rationalism, which requires omniscience, destroys the creator-creature distinction, and contradicts the very system he claims to represent. Also, the anything can happen claim destroys his own God concept. Darth's phrase, if you're in a chance world, anything can happen, accidentally applies to his own theology because his God is defined with 17 attributes that do not match Van Til's 7, P. Mars's 13, classical theism, or any historic creed. He cannot justify why those 17 attributes form the ultimate set. He admits ignorance of God's eternal pre-creation activity. He cannot justify God's salvific plan as eternal, contradicting immutability. He cannot justify God being creator before creation existed, which is logically incoherent. Darth therefore cannot demonstrate a stable, coherent, or necessary deity. Thus, his own worldview becomes the chance world he accuses others of inhabiting. Because if God's attributes are undefined, mismatched, inconsistent, and incomplete, then no stable metaphysical structure exists, and anything can happen, which destroys intelligibility, by his own words. Also, Darth's accusation boomerangs. He cannot demonstrate necessity. He claims Krauss is stuck with chance because he cannot name an ultimate. But Darth's own ultimate is undefined, missing key classical attributes, incoherent, contradictory across his own claims, not agreed upon even among his presuppositional colleagues, P-Mars list conflict, inconsistent with Van Til, 7 attributes versus his 17, and epistemically inaccessible. He admits God's eternity is unknown to him. Thus, Darth himself cannot satisfy his own demand, identify the ultimate or your worldview collapses. He cannot identify the ultimate. Therefore, by Darth's own criterion, his worldview collapses.
Do you believe that chance is ultimate, sir?
Yes.
Okay, well then you've now destroyed your ability to know anything.
4. Gary said, "Okay, well then, you've now destroyed your ability to know anything." Why this statement is self-defeating on Darth's own terms, attribute-based critique. This is one of Darth's most self-destructive claims because it clearly reveals the internal incoherence of his system. According to Darth, if your worldview lacks a fully specified, necessary, ultimate foundation, you destroy your ability to know anything. But under Darth's own framework, he fails to supply that very foundation. Below is the breakdown. 1. Darth's God cannot ground knowledge because Darth cannot define God's attributes coherently. Darth claims Krauss destroyed his ability to know anything because he accepted the possibility that chance might be ultimate. But Darth's own God concept is incomplete, missing several Van Til attributes such as aseity, immutability, necessity, etc. Inconsistent, contradicts the attribute set of fellow presuppositionalist P-Mars. Ad hoc, Darth constantly adds and removes attributes depending on the argument. Undefined pre-creation, Darth explicitly admitted he cannot answer what God was doing sans creation. If Darth cannot articulate the nature of the being he claims grounds all knowledge, then he has no non-chance foundation to appeal to. Thus, under his own rule, he destroys his own ability to know anything. Also, his statement presupposes a God that provides epistemic certainty, but his God, as defined, cannot do that. Darth's knowledge-destroying accusation requires a God whose aseity, sovereignty, necessity, immutability, omniscience, rationality, unity, and eternality are all clearly defined and internally consistent. But Darth's 17 attributes are not only inconsistent with Van Til's 7, they contradict P-Mars's 13. This means Darth does not even know what his God is in terms of essential nature. A being with undefined or contradictory attributes cannot serve as the necessary precondition of intelligibility, which is the very thing Darth claims is required for knowledge. Thus, Darth's own worldview produces the epistemic collapse he tries to assign to Krauss. Also, Darth demands a level of epistemic justification he himself cannot meet. He says Krauss destroyed his ability to know anything because Krauss supposedly cannot provide an ultimate metaphysical foundation. But Darth cannot provide a coherent account of God, cannot reconcile conflicting presuppositionalist attribute sets, cannot answer what God was doing sans creation, cannot demonstrate that his God, not P-Mars's, or an orthodox God, or a Thomist God, is the correct necessary being, and cannot demonstrate that his God grounds possibility and impossibility and intelligibility. Thus, by Darth's own standards, he has also destroyed his ability to know anything. Darth's critique boomerangs back onto himself. Also, the accusation presupposes that anything less than certainty equals unknowability. Yet Darth has no certainty in his own system. Darth asserts, God has not revealed X. I cannot answer that. I do not know what God was doing sans creation. We can only know what God has revealed. I don't know the details of that attribute. But if ignorance of fundamentals destroys knowledge, as Darth claims, then Darth's admitted ignorance means Darth has destroyed his own ability to know anything. because by his own definition, his worldview must collapse if the foundation is undefined. Therefore, Gary's worldview necessarily collapses into the very chance world he accuses others of holding. His criticism of Krauss becomes a self-referentially incoherent act under the weight of its own demands. He insists that only his worldview can provide the necessary preconditions of intelligibility. Yet the God he appeals to is described with an attribute set that is incomplete, inconsistent, and internally contradictory, not only against classical theism and other presuppositionalists, but against Darth's own requirement that God possess every essential property without deficit or lack. And when pressed on what his God was doing sans creation, Darth openly admits he doesn't know because it wasn't revealed, thereby conceding that the eternally necessary attributes of his supposed foundation of intelligibility are unknown and unknowable. A worldview whose core foundation is undefined, contradictory, and epistemically inaccessible cannot, by Darth's own rules, function as the precondition of anything, least of all intelligibility. Thus, his transcendental argument doesn't just fail, it self-destructs at the starting line, leaving him with a worldview that is no more coherent or intelligible than the nonsense he accuses others of believing.
Dr. Krauss, if nothing on a metaphysical level, on the grand scheme of things, is impossible, then you cannot say what is, can, or cannot be, because nothing's impossible.
5. Gary said, Dr. Krauss, if nothing on a metaphysical level on the grand scheme of things is impossible, then you cannot say what is, can, or cannot be, because nothing's impossible. Why this statement is a direct, devastating self-own within Darth's worldview. This is one of the biggest self-destructions in the entire debate, and here's why. Darth says, if nothing is impossible, then you cannot say what can or cannot be. But Darth's own worldview cannot coherently declare that anything is impossible because Darth never defines God's attributes consistently. His attribute list contradicts P. Mars's list. Both contradict Van Til's classical list. He cannot describe God's eternal nature. He literally says, I couldn't answer that. He cannot describe God's pre-creation state or actions. He cannot define divine necessity without contradicting other presuppositionalists. If Gary's God concept is inconsistent, he cannot establish necessity, he cannot establish impossibility, he cannot establish modal boundaries, meaning he cannot say what cannot be. Therefore, by Gary's own standard, his worldview collapses into modal chaos, the very thing he accuses Krauss of. Also, this statement exposes Darth's strongest weakness. He depends on an impossible burden of certainty that he himself cannot meet. Darth demands absolute metaphysical impossibility, absolute grounding for modal claims, absolute understanding of the ultimate, absolute certainty of divine necessity. But Darth cannot define the divine attributes coherently, cannot explain God's eternal activity, cannot answer internal theological questions, contradicts other presuppositionalists, and he relies on an attribute set he stitched together from miscellaneous claims. This means Darth's worldview lacks the very foundation he demands from everyone else. This makes his argument self-referentially incoherent. Taken together, all of these contradictions become fatal the moment we include Darth's own admission that he has no idea what his God was doing sans creation because it was not revealed. Darth builds his entire worldview on the claim that his God is the necessary precondition of intelligibility, possessing a fully complete, non-deficient set of attributes from all eternity. Yet he simultaneously asserts that key attributes, especially sovereignty and creator status from eternity past, cannot be known, described, or even coherently affirmed because God never revealed what he was doing before creating anything. That means Darth is grounding intelligibility in a being whose eternally essential properties are admittedly unknown, whose nature differs from other presuppositional lists, creating contradictions in what is supposedly necessary, and whose actions, status, and role before creation cannot even be said to exist in a coherent, intelligible way. By Darth's own criteria, if even one essential attribute is unknown, missing, or contradictory, then the God he describes is not ultimate, not perfect, not necessary, and therefore cannot ground intelligibility. Thus, his worldview collapses into the very unintelligibility he accuses others of, because the foundation he appeals to is, by his own admission, undefined, incomplete, and epistemically unreachable. Darth's entire framework collapses. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching, and please feel free to leave any comments in the comment area below.